So yes, welcome to the Design Justice member story sharing session with Sarah Fathallah. We are going to get started. I will paste the session outline for folks into the chat. And now I'm just going to welcome in Sarah. So Sarah is a designer, researcher, and educator who specializes in applying design to the social sector with impact-driven clients like the International Rescue Committee and Open Society Foundations, to name a few. Sarah has also co-founded Design Gigs for Good, a free community-driven resource to help more people use the tools of design to create positive social change. And hopefully you've all taken a look at Sarah's story where she was interviewed by Discount about UX design and various other things. So Sarah will talk about her story today, and then we'll have some question and answer time. So I'm going to pass it over to Sarah, and I will post the session outline in the chat right now.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Victoria. Hi, everybody. I'm going to start sharing my screen because I would much rather have slides take up most of your screen than my face. So before I start it, I would love to echo Victoria's land acknowledgement and talk about how I'm speaking to you today from the territory of Huichin, which is a part of the unceded ancestral lands of the Lisjan-Ohlone. I recognize that I have benefited and continue to benefit from the seizure and occupation of this land. I commit to continue learning about the history of the land, to center and join the struggle of the Lisjan-Ohlone people and Indigenous peoples everywhere, and fight for Indigenous land stewardship and rematriation today and every day. And obviously, I urge everybody to do the same. I also want to acknowledge this morning the grief that our Asian friends and colleagues might be feeling today. If your mind and body are telling you that this isn't where you want to be right now, I urge you to listen to that voice, and obviously not just now, for as long as it takes. And for the rest of us, please check in on your family and loved ones. Ambiguous loss is hard, and we need each other now more than ever. With that, today I wanted to cover 3 things. I only have 10 minutes, so I want to really minimize the time that I'm speaking at you and maximize the time that we're speaking with each other and asking questions and discussing. So I'll just start with who I am very briefly, and then I'll spend most of the time going through lessons that I've learned throughout the years in my practice as a designer and design researcher, and then I'll just have a quick note at the end to wrap us up. So let me introduce myself. As a visual description, this is a picture of me standing against what was a blue sky but is grayed out, and I'm wearing a tank top and holding 2 mallets for a drum. My name is Sarah Fathallah, and I'm a freelance social designer and researcher. I work mostly in the social sector. This means that I mostly work with vulnerable communities, initially mostly in the global south, though now I also do a lot of work here in the so-called United States. The types of projects that I work on really span a variety of topics, from reproductive and sexual health to financial inclusion, education, foster care, you name it. And outside of my paid work, I'm also a police and prison abolition organizer, a drummer, or an aspiring one at least, and a plant and a dog parent. So let's get right into it. I wanted to talk through some lessons that I've learned through trial and error and practices that I now try to apply in my work. And many, if you're familiar with the 10 design justice principles, will be echoed here. As I go through them, my invitation to you is to reflect or jot down what you feel I might be missing, what I've gotten wrong, what you have found to work for you that is different from these lessons, etc. I would love for that to be a part of the discussion after the presentation. So I'm going to dive right into it. The first lesson is around really researching the parties and stakeholders that you're working with. Understanding what motivations they have, what they're getting out of the work, and determining whether the project ultimately seeks to recuperate or prop up the systems that are ultimately harmful to the most marginalized. So this is really about approaching the work with a discerning political analysis, I was doing some research for this paper, and let's imagine, for example, and these are actual projects that are done by actual design firms, that you are invited to work on a project that aims to improve the way police departments and communities communicate with one another. It may seem like a harmless project on the surface, but in digging deeper, you should understand that it frames the problem of police violence as one of lack of communication, which it's not. So you shouldn't be doing that kind of work if you are trying to avoid legitimizing state-sanctioned violence, for example. And related to that as a second lesson is really to build a political analysis, study critical race theory, feminist theory, queer theory, disability justice, indigenous sovereignty, and other critical thought to better understand how design might be reinforcing racism, sexism, heterosexism, ableism, and other isms. To allow us to have that discernment political analysis I mentioned earlier, we really need to learn about and build fluency in these critical traditions, whether that's through personal political study, through a group, study group, or a book club, or involvement in organizing and mutual aid, whichever way feels most appropriate for you. The third lesson is to approach any project with an understanding of the historical and systemic forces that are at play, so that you're able to focus on the structural conditions that impact the work and that impact how communities are behaving and are making decisions. And a part of that is to resist essentialism and develop the capacity to identify and counter logics of splitting up people into groups of deserving and undeserving, and also balancing individual specific stories with structural realities. When you reflect on how systemic oppression and or privilege affect communities and how they affect also the realities of the work, you are able to then go beyond just attributing everything to individual decisions and actions and failing to acknowledge the full story of how policies, regulations, institutions are affecting the structural conditions of those communities. It's also about, again, fighting back against essentialist notions that say, you know, poor people do this, as opposed to certain sets of practices historically results in the marginalization of poor people. And when you're working in presenting your findings around design research, for example, it's always best to frame them with statements about how things are around the communities that you've observed or interviewed or done research with, including information around things like the racialized wealth gap, public health disparities, state involvement in and policing of communities, etc. The fourth lesson is to practice self-reflectivity. Critical reflexivity is a recognition that the designer or researcher does not exist in a vacuum, but exists in relationship with what they're trying to understand, work on, or create. And this is not just about these like discrete moments in time, like, you know, pre-mortems and post-mortems, though those are important for feedback and reflection. But it's really about this like uncomfortable ongoing process of challenging your own assumptions, the assumptions that are embedded in ourselves, as well as reflect on our own power and privilege. We are not neutral, objective agents, so we need to be able to examine the ways in which our values, identities, and positionality affect our work, and our relationship with communities that we engage with. And researchers in the social sciences have offered different ways to build that critical reflexivity muscle, whether through autoethnography, and I don't want to call out people out of the blue, but I know that Alba has some experience with that, and or journaling, for example. So critical reflexivity is an ongoing process rather than an event. The fifth lesson involves around focusing on the impact of the design process now as much as the hypothetical impact of the design outcomes later. I'm also going to call out Alex Fiorillo here, who always says this wonderful phrase, which is just because something is designed doesn't mean it's better. Going through the design process, no matter how meticulously or earnestly, does not guarantee that the resulting outcomes will actually bring about positive change unless there's evidence and rigorous evaluation suggesting otherwise. And so because we cannot guarantee that the outcomes of the design work will ultimately lead to positive impact, we need to ensure that the processes themselves can be beneficial to community members. This means actually paying and compensating people. This means actually building capacity and sharing your tools, frameworks, and knowledge. And when you're doing so, do not require communities to speak the jargon of design in order to use the tools of design. It's about really a commitment to improving the material conditions of communities and ensuring that everyone is getting something from the work, and build that into project proposals and budgets, and not leave it as something that is an optional feature of the process. The sixth lesson is around centering lived experience and valuing lived experts as much as subject matter and process experts. When I talk about value, it includes obviously holding their contributions in the same regard, but also monetary value. I know I'm going to start sounding like a broken record, but please pay people. This also means hiring people with lived experience as part of the teams who are moving the work along, and or having advisory committees or bodies that are comprised of people with lived experience, and not in a tokenizing way. They need to actually hold decision-making power. When you're working with communities who are marginalized, underserved, or harmed by institutions or system, try to elevate their stories as you would those of survivors, because communities most often are surviving systems that have been harmful to them for a long period of time. And again, this is not about inviting people to participate by interviewing them or providing feedback on a prototype. It's also about creating the space for them to be creators of their own inquiry and meanings and solutions, whether that's through scoping the engagement, planning out the design research, conducting it, framing the findings and recommendations, acting on them, et cetera, et cetera. The seventh lesson here is around relationship building and investing in relationship building with communities. Working in solidarity with and amplifying the power of community-based organizations, and truly being in service of communities through non-hierarchical ways of working. This is about stopping the tendency for design engagements to be in parachuting in mode. If your work is not dedicated to that community in the long run, then your job is not to lead, but to support your colleagues and partners who are from or who are embedded in that community to do the work well after you leave. So when I'm leading a team working in a community that isn't mine, non-hierarchical leadership means enabling team members to nurture and hold on to relationships way after I'm gone. So they're the ones who are leading interviews. They're the ones who are leading engagements. They're the ones who are doing the literal work of community building. And I can take it back, step back and literally get out of the way, whether that's doing childcare or taking notes or basically just doing whatever it takes to allow them to foster those relationships. The eighth lesson is around recognizing the power and influence that comes with being a designer. Designers yield a lot of power in their role as they hold the key to methodology, the key to design outcomes, whether that's through ownership of the process, access to people and information, the ability to assign validity to what you're getting out of the process, authorship, credit, praise, you name it. There's a lot of asymmetrical power relations that can appear in the relationship between a designer and a community, whether that's, in your positionality, whether that's through the distribution of benefits of the design process, whether that's in how you frame, who has the power to frame conclusions and outcomes. So really, we need to build our capacity to recognize those power differentials between us and communities so as to ultimately undo dominance behaviors and seed power. And what I mean by undue dominance behaviors is this idea that we have on one end the designers who are the experts and have the training and are paid, and on the other end, the subjects and participants who don't know any better, whose time is not as valuable, and so they're not paid. So in addition to compensation, again, it also means creating the space for communities to lead the process, to own the data and outcomes that are generated from it, and also to hold you accountable. Like a good litmus test is, can they get rid of you? Can they fire you if need be? The penultimate lesson here is to use an asset-based lens instead of a deficit-based lens. I was inspired by a term that Gerald Visner coined in the context of indigenous research, which is survivance, a mix of survival and resistance. So how can we celebrate communities' acts of survival and active resistance rather than contribute to and perpetuate narratives of their problems and downfalls? This means affirming the ways in which communities have already survived the issues that may be the impetus of the work rather than define them by those issues. This means also focusing on what communities can do rather than only the areas of problems. This can look like engaging in world building, future visioning activities rather than simply highlighting pain points and problems. And then last but not least, try to learn about and seek to understand trauma, both at the individual and collective levels, what triggers are and what trauma does to the body. Once I started reading and taking classes about trauma, it struck me how it really affects memory in ways that are sometimes counter to how we designers ask people to recount their experiences. For example, when someone goes through a traumatic experience, their memory is encoded as sensory fragments rather than sequential and fully contextualized experiences. So it doesn't really make sense to try and like journey map someone's painful experience. We also need to understand in developing like trauma-informed approaches to engaging with communities, how trauma appears in individuals, how to track changes in affective states so that we can properly care for someone's well-being, but we also need to recognize trauma at the community level with things like research fatigue and institutional neglect. And so ending with this last lesson, I want to leave you with this one parting thought. If this all feels like it's about learning and unlearning, it's because it is. When you realize that design as a discipline has deeply rooted history in capitalism and that its tools were theorized and applied first in the commercial sector, as we attempt to apply design in more just, equitable, socially and environmentally conscious ways, we're bound to come face to face with all the ways in which it's inherently inadequate. And I think we're still figuring out a lot of the ways in which we're trying to shift our collective practices while understanding, the constraints of the highly oppressive systems that we're operating within. So the best thing I've found solace in is curiosity and study. I spend a lot of time reading up on what people much smarter than me have done, what they've tried, what they feel is working, what is not working, and not just in design, but also in adjacent fields like the social sciences as well. There's this Maya Angelou quote that goes, do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better. If you read the D-Scout story, you probably saw that as well. Except this is not a destination, it's a journey. So I challenge us to continually question and improve the way we were taught to do design, learn from one another, and collectively do better. Thank you for having me. Thanks for listening. And I look forward to your questions and discussion.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Sorry I had a diabetes thing. That's what I was doing here. So now we're going to move into breakout rooms for about 10 minutes. I'm posting into the chat right now the link to the Google Jamboard. So I'm going to split you into breakout rooms of about 3 or 4 people. And using that Google Jamboard, you can what am I trying to say? Go to the Jamboard page that matches the breakout room number that you will be in. And I'm going to show you quickly how to use the Jamboard, just in case you're not familiar, but you also do not have to use the Jamboard at all. So it's just there as a tool if you want to use it. So I'm going to do a quick screen share just to show you in case you haven't used it before. Here it is. Share. So hopefully you can see the Jamboard here. Does it say DJ and story sharing? Yeah, and then I've created 6 rooms, and conveniently, I've made 6 breakout rooms as well. So this is just here for you to have a short kind of conversation with other Design Justice members about the stories that we just heard, to propose any questions that you might want to propose to Sarah. And you can, as you see this little arrow here, copy and paste this link. I will put it in the chat as well. But there's a chat section there's a question section in the session outline for today where you can post your questions. And if you want to post the questions anonymously, you can either maybe private message it to me in the chat, or post it right into that Google Doc. And there's also the option, of course, to ask your question out loud once we come back. So just quickly to show you the breakout room and how this Google Jamboard works. If when you're in your rooms, you want to take some notes on the questions that you see, you could click this, a sticky note, and type in some words there. And when you click save, it shows up on the board over here. So if you're brainstorming, you can use that feature. There's a picture feature if you want to add an image from your computer. There's some shapes and circles. You can draw things. There's a text box where you can start typing things. So use it if it feels right. If not, just have the conversation with the folks that you're in the room with. And I'll repost that link, and I'm going to send you into the breakout rooms now. And you'll have about 10 minutes, and I'll put an announcement in to remind you that you're going to come back in, and then we'll have question and answer time with Sarah. So I'm going to stop sharing, and then I'm sending you into your rooms. Welcome back, everyone. I hope that was a nice time to do breakouts and maybe meet some of your fellow Design Justice members. That's part of the objective of doing the breakout groups, to allow you to kind of meet each other for a bit, but also to have like a quiet, more private session to think through any questions you might have. I pasted into the chat again just a link to the Google Doc, which is the session outline you've already been following, but a section for where you can write in questions that you want to ask Sarah. But I'm going to start by just putting out into the group of all of us now. Does anyone have a question that you want to say out loud just to ask Sarah directly? And feel free to just unmute yourself and go for it if you want to.
Hello, this is Sheldon. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. So, so my quick question, some of the folks who are in my breakout group know that I am in the process of launching a development business where we just build more inclusive mobile and web apps. And so one of the big challenges there, as we were talking, was about how to include the community in that design process. And, particularly like for me, it's not my business. I'm not building whatever the app is, right? But as I'm working with these folks, with some of my clients, what's the best way to make sure that they are not just leveraging, basically extracting information or extracting value from those communities, but are fairly compensating them? Like, what's a good way to kind of tie that in so that, kind of everybody's winning together as well?
I guess your leverage as an organization that's working with those partners or those clients is to, make it a conditional, like a non-negotiable condition to working with them. I understand that not everybody has that high of a leverage with clients and partners, but if the way that you present or talk about your approach does incorporate community engagement as part of like the process of developing these apps, then I think it will certainly appeal to the right organizations who are open to that, and then you have less sort of work to do to then try and convince them otherwise.
Yeah.
I think one of the ways also that I found working with some partners of mine were, are they committed to having people in their teams who are a part of the communities that they're trying to serve, especially if this is something that they're engaged in the long term. So I have, for example, worked on a project in the child welfare space where a condition of my working with the nonprofit that I was consulting for was that they hire someone with lived experience in the system in that particular state that we were operating in as a condition of doing the work. I don't know. I'm sure that doesn't like fully answer your question, but those are a couple of thoughts.
No, I mean, it's helpful, if nothing else, to reinforce kind of this need to kind of make that a condition, not sort of as an option. I'm also just, and you don't necessarily have to answer this question, but I'm also just curious as well. I'm thinking about, what does that look like? How do I make that simple for somebody to say, hey, look, you got to give them, equity, you got to give them, this amount, whatever it's, I don't know, a couple $100. Again, I don't know what that number is. You've got to, what are those things is what I'm just thinking about. And again, if you don't necessarily have all those answers or some of those answers right now, that's fine. But that's something else that's just on my mind of how to not just say, hey, this is a condition, but also kind of spell out like the best ways to execute, if that makes sense.
No, that totally makes sense. And I think some of the options that you've discussed are like worthwhile exploring. I don't have as much experience in the design of products. And by that, I mean like discrete like things that are being used. So I think I haven't really looked at those kinds of options of like what would, ownership of that product look like with the community. But I think that those are worthwhile avenues to explore. And you can approach clients with different options and then have them sort of pick which ones feels most appropriate.
Okay. Cheers.
Thank you. Does anyone have another question they want to say out loud? If not, there's quite a few questions listed in the doc as well.
Yeah, I have one. Hi,
Great.
Sarah.
Hi, Matt.
I have two questions in one. I'm all done for the trauma-informed. I am so happy you're talking about that. This is so critical. Do you have any resources of trauma-informed, participatory, community-centered design, like stuff that I could read and catch up on where you are, even though I think I'm already doing, but I'm doing from my own experience. And I think it's always good to read and have more resources. And I have another one also. Around community-led, like a product or survey that is not community-centered, but community-led. If you have any experience with that, as I'm trying to do now.
Sure. So for the first one, I'm going to actually copy a link that Kellyanne McKirker, who's based in Australia, they put together resources that I've contributed resources to this page, but it's the most expansive one that I found, at least, that has a lot of the resources out there. I will mention that, they're not perfect. There's a lot of things around trauma-informed design that I feel like has not been fully addressed publicly. But this is a good place to start, at least, in my opinion. And then what I would recommend also is just to learn about trauma-informed care outside of design, whether that's in healthcare and behavioral health or whatnot, just because those are the spaces that I've looked at in order to like learn the basics of trauma and then try and apply that in my design practice. while we wait for, I don't know, the end all be all type of guide or set of resources. On your second question about community-led versus community-centered, I think was the dichotomy. So one example of that, it does not happen in a lot of the projects that I've worked on. I will admit that that's the minority. But one of the projects that I worked on was in Jordan, and it was specifically around Syrian refugees and like issues that are caused by long-term displacement. And my client at the time, the International Rescue Committee, realized that there has been a lot of work that was done where the nonprofit would come in with like a process and say, we're going to involve communities at different points in time, and then we're going to come up with a new program or a solution. And that didn't really make a big dent in the state of like displacement and like the conditions that Syrian refugees had in Jordan. And so they approached it differently, where they wanted to start sort of like what they called it an innovation lab, but I think that was mostly for like getting funding type of reasons. I don't know that it's like a typical innovation lab, but the idea was, how do we put the people who are most affected by the problem in charge of solving the problem? And part of that was hiring a team of Syrian refugees who were doing like community outreach, who were like in charge of the project, who did a lot of community consultations around first just scoping which problems they should be tackling, and then like they went through like a bunch of like actual like going door to door and like talking to people in their homes, and then like synthesizing that information and having workshops with people to validate what they've heard, and like then voting on like the top 3 issues that they should work on. And our job, me and other designers and other people in the team who had like other expertise in monitoring and evaluation and whatnot, our job was literally to just provide like training and capacity building and like some advisory capacity, and that's it. Like if they wanted to do the process a certain way, like I could come in and say, you should like, if you want to do like observation, you should like, you know, pay attention to this like bias or whatever. But like I was not in a power to say, don't do it, or like go about the process to do it in that way. And that was like a very unique setup. I haven't seen it done in other projects, but it really like it came from like a lot of political will up front to say, we are like taking a step back. I think in other projects, the best way that I can try to incorporate that mindset of community-led versus community-centered is to, when I try to approach working with the community, I take the time to look for existing ways that they already like discuss issues in their community, that they come together for solutions, that they like do consensus building or voting or whatever. So in this project that I mentioned earlier on foster care, going into it, I realized there's a lot of like youth advisory board that is comprised of young people who are currently or formerly from the foster care systems, who use those kinds of avenues to just advocate for like better policy that revolves around foster care. And so we're like, well, rather than like start something from scratch, like why don't we embed into these youth advisory boards and like provide the tools of design and say, okay, we would love for you to lead this process that we're trying to do, which is to like reimagine the adolescent experience in Washington State. Are you okay with that? Like, how would compensation look like if you wanted to take this work on? And then how do we like support you in developing that process together? I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I hope other people gain knowledge too, because I did.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. I think I'm going to read, there's 2 questions, because some of the questions are similar to what's been asked. I'm going to read 2 that are a little bit different. So one, and Sarah, you tell me if it's too much. So the first one is, how do you respond when your design harms or causes trauma, or a project that you've inherited has harmed or caused trauma?
Mm-hmm.
So that's the first question. And then the second question, it's a bit longer, but how do you make a financially sustainable life and also follow through on the lessons that you shared around the design justice principles. The person sharing just that I feel like I've managed to do work in a way that fully encapsulates my values as an activist, but I wasn't getting paid to fundraise by piecing together donations and small grants. And I turned down contracts that are not in alignment with the principles, but then I end up being unemployed. And I'm disabled, taking on work that is sort of aligned, but pushing the whole time for values alignment, which ends up being inaccessible, which a lot of unpaid hours. So it was a long question and 2 questions in one, but I'm wondering if there's a good...
Absolutely. So I'll start with the first question around if you cause harm or trauma, or the project that you've inherited has caused harm and trauma. Chances are, if you're working with vulnerable communities, you are going to cause harm. Like, harm is not something that is, what we think about in Law and Order on TV. Like, it's from small things like the emotional toll and burden that can an interview can cause to someone, to something bigger, like re-triggering a past trauma. I think if I were, say, in an interview or a co-design session, and such a thing happens, the first thing is to just like acknowledge and name what's happening. Like, it sounds like maybe this was not the right question to ask, or it sounds like insert whatever like change in affective states you've noticed, rather than ignore it. The second thing is to listen, but do not pry. So don't like chase the story. Don't force people to tell you what's going on. Let people talk about it if they want to. And if they share their feelings, to really validate the veracity of those feelings. Like, don't minimize it by saying things like, it will be okay, it will pass, or, everything happens for a reason. It could be something as simple as saying, I'm sorry you're feeling, use their own words to describe how they're felt, and this sounds, terrible, frustrating, insert other adjective. I think you can also offer options for ways to move forward, like, what would you like us to do next? And that could mean taking a break, taking some deep breaths, or other self-soothing activity. It can be like sharing referral paths of resources. A lot of our projects that I go into it will have like a counselor on hand, or will have like referral paths to existing like counseling or mental health hotlines, and then make sure that they are in control, and like whichever options that they choose actually follow through, and let them take the lead. So these are just some like on the moment ways to do it. If you've inherited a project that has caused past trauma, the first and foremost thing to do is to actually acknowledge it, and not shy away from the responsibility of what that means, and offer options for repairing that harm if they're available to you. And again, it will highly depend on what the harm is. So there's no like blank, like, this is what you should do in all cases. So going to the question around doing unpaid labor, and like how financially sustainable it is to follow all of the DJN principles, I 100% agree. I think my most my like purest work is work that I do unpaid, on my own hours, especially with my like prison and police abolition organizing. What I would recommend is to develop your own sets of criteria for what feels morally right to you, and what feels the most reasonable based on what is available in terms of like demand for your skill sets. I don't think that the answer is to say, I will never take any projects that have this particular issue or that particular issue, or that misaligns with the principles in one way or another. I think it's like giving yourself a framework to think through potential projects that you're working on, and then prioritizing which are more important than others. I know, for example, that while I care deeply about the climate crisis, in my own set of criteria for approaching projects, like sustainability is not high on the list, because I care more about other issues. That's not to say that I would, want to reify like, pollution or climate change deniers or anything like that. But I will engage in projects that don't necessarily have an outwardly explicit like analysis on how the project will impact the environment, for example. So yeah, just be kind to yourself. Don't think that it's on you, like that, like the idea that like we all are individually responsible for for undoing and dismantling all of these oppressive systems is like it's like a neoliberal view of the world that is like highly harmful to each and every one of us. Just think through it with like a view of like morality and what you feel like you need to like, what are your lines on the sand, which ones you are not willing to cross, and then which ones you feel like are less of a priority. I don't know if that helps. Again, it's like it depends on each person.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's right at the hour, and I just put a note in the chat that we can stay on for another 5 minutes just because we ran a bit late. So I'll put out to the crowd. Does anyone have any other questions that you wanted to pose that I haven't yet read or we haven't said so far?
Yes. I have a question. Oh, somebody else has a question?
Go ahead, Shanta, and then the next person can go after you.
Thank you, Victoria. First of all, I want to thank Sarah for a great, brave leadership, like in regards to what the projects that you're taking on and what you talked about. I'm actually really advocating for that myself, like also like working with survivors of trauma and having those trauma-informed ways. And I think I find it very challenging. For example, like to really create these platforms, virtual spaces, because of COVID, I mean, we are all kind of in the virtual space for creating, like implementing the design justice principles in creating apps and hotlines and also like virtual spaces that are more trauma informed and inclusive. Like I just kind of went with like, I just kind of created this ideas approach, which is again, inclusive, diverse, diversity driven, equitable, IDE is accessible and safe. So, but I find it very challenging, even myself as being a survivor of all forms of violence, that, like when you're trying to kind of implement these sort of, from a technology perspective and also like from a community perspective, that how do we address a lot of these issues, like about violence and gender-based violence. And I think, and also like we're really seeing a lot like in human trafficking and food security and homelessness. Like I want to kind of really see like there's a lot of barriers that I find, like how to even partner with people like yourself, Sarah, like to kind of really get them on board to really create these sort of, projects that, or, to create these virtual spaces, whether through like apps or, like some kind of virtual space where, people can feel safe enough and then they can really have the services that they need that are really critical. And how do we address them? And I know you said like, creating those conditions where I sort of advocate for that too, like, like having the survivors. That's why I'm taking a lead on myself as a survivor to implement these programs. What do you say, like, how do you get on board like people like yourself and onto these projects who can really perhaps work with you to lead on these?
If my understanding of the question is like, how do I convince people to work on these projects?
Yeah, like, like people to kind of, because I think like with capacity building, right? So like, like I know what needs to be done, for example, and I have the background and I want to kind of create these spaces and I know, but how do you get like, for the funding, like I'm kind of going and applying and doing a lot of those things, but these are all like barriers, right? That you want to make sure like you implement these programs and you implement these spaces because it's so much needed. But to get people like, who are kind of aligned with the same sort of, mindset, like I wouldn't even say like the morality. I think it's beyond morality. It's more about integrity, like, human integrity, I would say, like our dignity, that, what, like people are like, you'd say, yeah, what, this is about time that we need to address, like, like, as I said, like, a lot of the inequities and injustices that we see within our systems, and there's huge gaps that we want to address, like in, you know, from an equity lens as well, and social justice and justice overall. And getting people in or organizations on board, like, you know, like people like you who are actually working and addressing it, to, you know, like convince them or kind of get them on board. I would say, like, you know, because like like for example, like I'm reaching out, nobody knows me, and I find that such a challenge that you know, when you're not like someone known, you're the unknown, and you're in your own vulnerability trying to really address a lot of these that has impacted you, for example, and you're like, okay, you know what, I have the courage that I'm going to take a lead on it. Now I'm reaching out, and people, I've seen like people, you know, shut doors in organizations, like, you know what, we don't know you, who are you? And it's like, yeah, I'm at the very, very grassroots level that I'm really reaching out, you know, and it's about time that we address them. So that those are just challenges that I'm saying, like, you know, if you're not known someone, or if you're not like somebody that, you know, like out there kind of, you know, and then you know, people don't even respond, you know, that I just find, like, you know, how do you even reach out and say, you know what, this needs to be addressed, this is a critical issue. Like, you know, we talk about like I'm kind of engaged with like human trafficking now, and you know, a lot of like sexual exploitation of minors and, you know, women and marginalized communities, and like just even talking about it is like, because it's so much stigma attached to it, and it's a crisis, like it's an issue in Canada, it's a big issue that we have here. But you know, like, and then I just really like, you know, kind of creating these platforms really for survivors and communities, and even like, you know, maybe even Muslim community. And so a lot of there's so much like where you don't even get those partnerships with people to kind of really come with you on board and say, you know what, yes, let's do it. You know, it's about time, we need to address it.
Oh, perfect. We only have like a very few couple more minutes left, so I'm going to give Sarah some space to quickly answer. If folks have to go, just another big thank you for everyone who helped with note taking. And Val, we might have missed your question, so if you want to type it in the chat quick, I'll yeah. Okay, great. Go, Sarah, and we'll.
Okay, so I'm going to try and answer very quickly. One, all of those challenges are real. I will say that I'm not necessarily the best place to answer them, because I don't start up my own projects. I respond to like existing projects that are already being built from other, like from community organizations or partners. So I have taken on the lazy route, which is to not like build up my own work. So I don't really feel like I have a lot to offer there. Valerie, your question is around how we scale the lessons presented today along with the DJN principle. Do you see education as a way of doing that? Yes. I think definitely there's some work to be done on the design education front to just like challenge some of the ways in which we take for granted, like the tools and methods and approaches that we are doing things, and also start to build that critical self-reflexivity in design students. But I also think that it's an approach to doing work that doesn't rely on, you know, this one-time like 4-year or 2-year degree and then you're set for life. In other professions, we know that, you know, like even in law, for example, you have to like continually do professional development so as to be like abreast of like what's new, what's different. And I think because we don't have that in a structured way in design, unfortunately, what that comes down to is your own personal like study and curiosity, whether that's like book clubs and reading and like attending events and like talking with one another. I have my own like group of like folks that I like love and appreciate their professional opinions on things, and we like bounce off ideas off of one another. So I think there's different avenues to like continue doing that, like continuous learning and growth, if that makes sense. I'm trying to be very quick because I want to also be respectful of people's times.
I just want to make sure we're respectful of your time because I know you have something after this. So yeah, so everyone, thank you so much for being here today. I hope that all the questions that you asked were answered. There are notes that some amazing volunteers that are still here were taking today. Maybe there'll be a write-up about the in the future. And of course, the video will edit it and post it on the YouTube channel. But I think somebody asked in the chat if we could email it out. So everybody who registered, I'll send a link with the notes and with the video. So yeah, thank you all so much for being here, for asking questions, for participating. And Sarah, thank you so much, like, from everybody. I'm really excited for some of the other folks in this call to be the person who will be speaking someday about their stories. And yeah, thanks everybody for being here. Have a good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you are in the world. And so great to have you all here.
Thank you for having me. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Victoria.